So welcome back to week 2 of Nerding in the Gospels. We're on to the Gospel of Mark. Again, we got lots of nerding facts to you. I'm going to read a lot of stuff to you. Your conversation afterwards is going to be, wow, let's talk about all this stuff. So I hope you gathered with your people and you're ready to learn some more nerding deep dive facts about the Gospel of Mark and the 4 Gospels together. Please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, because we just want you to be a part of us. We have our YouTube channel here, and then we also meet together live and have these conversations on Friday night over Zoom. So you're invited to that also. All right, so we're going to deep dive into the Gospel of Mark tonight. It was written by a Christian scribe, John Mark. He was the son of a Jerusalem widow, and we meet Mark's mother in Acts 12 through 14 with this kind of funny, famous story. When he realized this, he went to the home of Mary, this is Peter, the mother of John Mark, where many were gathered for prayer. He knocked at the door in the gate, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to open it. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the door, she ran back inside and told everyone, "Peter is standing at the door." So there's the funny, humorous story. But John Mark's mother's home was so well known as a place of prayer, as a place for Christians gathering, that Peter just went there when he got released from prison miraculously to tell the people that he was released. So this is the home that John Mark grew up in. Mark's explanations of Jewish customs support the belief that he wrote this to the Gentiles. It was written to the believers in Rome, and this is called the Suffering Christ Gospel because the believers in Rome under Nero at this time were suffering greatly with that persecution. This would be, they're guessing like around, again, Roman history verifies this. In AD 64, there's a great fire in Jerusalem that Nero blamed it on the Christians. And then the persecution began pretty strongly with them, building up to AD 70 when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed again. So they believe this was written before that destroying of the temple, because again, it's not mentioned, kind of like the book of Matthew here. John Mark was a close associate of Paul for a while, but he collected the stories for his gospel from Peter. Peter called him a son, as in 1 Peter 5:13. Your sister church here in Babylon, which would be Rome, sends you greetings. So does my son Mark. How nice is that, huh? If Mark wrote his gospel shortly after Peter's death, as many scholars think, the date of the gospel would fall into the mid to late 60s AD. So it's not too far of a reach to see a lot of Peter's side in the Gospel of Mark. Peter was arrested in Rome, awaiting trial. Mark goes to him to get Peter's versions of the Jesus story. And then that's why he's in Rome writing to the Gentiles who are persecuted. And then Peter is crucified upside down, as it is recorded in history. And we get the Gospel of Mark. Mark is considered the founder of the church in Egypt, specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church. This would be another history fact outside of the Bible. He would have been the first bishop of Alexandria, where, according to tradition, he suffered martyrdom himself around AD 68. Outside historical reference, the church in Egypt, don't get any white faces there. I don't know what color Mark was. He was a Greek, mixed Jewish Greek, but he went to Egypt for that first church. Mark is one of the last people mentioned in one of Paul's final letters in 2 Timothy 4:11, where he said, "Only Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry." This is so interesting. Wouldn't you love a biography of Mark? Because we know him to being in the book of Acts. John Mark was traveling with Paul for that first missionary journey when he was with Barnabas, and something John Mark did, he left mid-journey, and Paul and Barnabas actually had a fight, a debate, an argument over John Mark. Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark back onto the next journey, missionary journey, and Paul was like, no, he left us the first time, no. And they argued about it so much that Barnabas and Paul split. And so Barnabas took John Mark with him, and then Silas joined Paul. But John Mark was the cause of that, and yet here at the end of Paul's life, he's saying, bring Mark when you come, for it will be helpful to me in my ministry. I want to know what happened. You know, Barnabas did not write anything, which is why we don't know much about him. But if you study the book of Acts, he is one of the great first Christian founders of the church. He just didn't write anything, so we don't know much about him. So then he took along John Mark. What did he teach John Mark to make him become this John Mark? I want to know so much more about Barnabas and about John Mark's biography, but we don't. But I give you that curiosity to talk about. So, next to the Apostle John, there's more biblical information about Mark than any other gospel writer. Yet we don't know enough, do we? Luke mentions him several times in the book of Acts, John Mark. Paul mentions him in 2 Timothy. So, again, Mark interviewed Peter, was in Rome, traveled with Paul and Barnabas, again with Barnabas to the early churches. Imagine the people John Mark got to talk to, that circle of people. Mark was not an apostle, and he likely wrote the version from Peter. We talked about this. Yet the Gospel of Mark bears the name of Mark, not the Gospel of Peter, because the way the Greeks named their books back at this time period was after the author. So this is true of Greek books too. The book was named Homer, after the author Homer. So the Gospel of Mark was named Mark after the author. The Gospel of Matthew was named Matthew after the Gospel written by Matthew. The book of Luke, named after Luke. John, the same thing. This is just the way Greeks named their books at this time. So, my question, did Mark make an anonymous cameo in his own writing? In Mark 14:50 through 51, there's this little section in the story in the Garden of Gethsemane. It says, then all his disciples deserted him and ran away. One young man followed behind, was clothed only in a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. I have long believed that was John Mark saying that he was there because he wasn't a disciple. He was just a scribe coming along with Paul and doing Peter's story, whatever. I think he was there. But I did some deep diving on this, Lydia McGrew and other theologians, and they mostly say it's not. They don't know who it is. They mostly believe it is not Mark. I am still choosing to believe it is Mark. I think it makes the author want to say that I did know Jesus this little teeny tiny bit because his mother had some kind of a faith early on. So I think so. And then you'll notice that when you read the Gospel of Mark, it kind of ends at Mark 16:8, and then there's this extra ending that's been added on, and whatever translation you're reading, it'll say something about this like earliest translations don't have this ending. Let's talk about that confusion, that concern, that question for a moment. So the original has an ending at Mark 16:8, and it is, the women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. The last word in that sentence in verse 8 in the Greek is a conjunction and or in the Greek word it's gar. But I don't read Greek, I'm just reading you what I read. And a word that they would never end a sentence in Greek with a conjunction. So it looks very much like the ancient text was broken off. And if you consider the chance that maybe Mark died before he got to finish his text, maybe, and some scribe who knew Mark added the ending, one theory, or that because of the persecution that was going on, that maybe some of it was, the original was destroyed, and then they pieced it together from other churches that had copies of Mark, and they pieced it together to add the correct ending on. Those are all very likely historical things that could have caused this earliest manuscripts to having ended with a conjunction, and they added the rest, which is the Great Commission in there, and the rest of the resurrection story. Makes sense. Isa Macaulay's a theologian I love. He likes to think about this, saying maybe Mark just ended it with this undefined ending, because that's what the resurrection does for us. It opened up the rest of the story for us to live. I love that thought. It's a very brave thought. I love the holy tension of it. We're not afraid of holy tension in this church. But I still think ending it with a conjunction of these other theories make more sense. But to say that the ending that is there, that may not be the earliest, but the rest of the Mark 16, it makes sense that we can trust it to be true to what it is. Because it matches up with the other Gospels so well. So question is, again, why did these Gospels make the cut and not the other Gospels? We talked last week about how they were just the most popular, most widely circulated, and that added a lot to why all the books of the New Testament got put into the New Testament. But this is also another important fact. These Gospels were written 30 to 60 years after the life of Jesus. 60 years would be like the Gospel of John. We'll get to that in a couple weeks. There are at least 99 other known apocryphal Gospels, such as the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of the Nativity of Mary. These other Gospels you may have heard about, been teased about, maybe you've read them yourself, were written up to 200 years after the life of Jesus. These four Gospels we have are written nearer to the life of Jesus. This is a big difference. So one of the big reasons why those are not canonized, besides the later date, is that these Gospels only mention prominent people and not random people. We're going to see that more in the next few weeks here. Some of the randomness things that were just written in, that if you're writing like a fictionalized account 200 years later, you wouldn't include such random stuff. You'll see this coming up. But let me just kind of give you this writing trick. If I was trying to create a fictional story like a gospel, if I was writing the story currently in current times, I'd tell you the story of what happened at our church on Friday night. I would mention, if I was doing it current time, I'd mention everybody that came to our church Friday night. And, someone said this and this person said this. And one of our regulars is a young adult named Marie, who's just very shy. But she's there all the time. We love her. She's a part of our church family. And I would mention that Marie was there and we had this conversation together. Now, if I was 100 years later and I was writing about this conversation that we had at our church, I would probably not mention Marie's name because she didn't add to the conversation. She was just there present, and it would have just been forgotten or not a detail that was known in the historic going back to it. So when there are just big prominent names mentioned, it does lend to some doubt of the historical accuracy of these later Gospels. Does that make sense? And then these later non-canonical Gospels can include legendary and embellished stories. where these first four Gospels read like real history. The late 2nd century Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, modern France, suggested these four as the most acceptable, but by then this was probably already pretty standard practice because they were already widely circulated. But here in the 2nd century, a bishop declared these four Gospels to be true and the others to be embellished. And around 150 years after Jesus died, this group of four was already circulating to the churches as a set. Again, this just naturally happened because they were accurate. They were the nearest. They were the most popular. They felt true to the people back then. And then they started becoming circulated as the four together to the churches. And the other Gospels just didn't have the staying power this close to the life of Jesus. Even 200 years later, they just didn't have the staying power of being true. Now, again, with science and history and agnostics studying, all of a sudden these other Gospels are popping up to be saying, look, this might be the real Jesus. I'm saying that's a current thing. It's not a historic thing. And so I also, in studying this to answer these questions you may be having, if you want to read other, no problem. You want to read other books to understand more of the times of Jesus, the recommendation I have for you that came from what I've been reading is to not read these apocryphal books that are 200 years later, but read other historical readings from the time of Jesus. So 200 years earlier. These things in the 1st century, there's two historians, Josephus and Eusebius, that are 1st century historians, and they reference all kinds of things that the Roman history books back up. Read those things that also back up the Gospels more than something written 200 years later, because that would not even be 1st century accurate. Does that make sense? So don't be afraid of those Gospels, but there's a lot of reasons why their staying power didn't make them true to become a part of our canonized Bible. All right? So, let's talk about more of these undesigned coincidences. Again, coincidences. So one through line that the Gospels consistently pick up is there is a prejudice against Galileans. And external sources like Josephus verify this. John 1:46 says, "Nazareth," exclaimed Nathanael, "can anything good come from Nazareth? Come and see for yourself," Philip replied. There's this prejudice against Galileans. Matthew 26:73. A little later, some of the other bystanders came over to Peter and said, "You must be one of them. We can tell by your Galilean accent." This is like saying, "You must be from Mississippi." Sorry, Mississippians, but you know what I'm talking about here, right? John 7:41-42. Others said he is the Messiah. So others said, "But he can't be. Will the Messiah come from Galilee? For the scriptures state clearly that the Messiah will be born of the royal line of David in Bethlehem, the village where King David was born." Again, Jesus, the Messiah, cannot come from Galilee. It is that part of the world. No. And then when Nicodemus tries to defend Jesus, their reply betrays an obvious regional prejudice. John 7:50-52. Then Nicodemus, the leader who had met with Jesus earlier, spoke up. "Is it legal to convict a man before he was given a hearing?" he asked. They replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Search the scriptures and see for yourself. No prophet ever comes from Galilee." Nicodemus, this is such a slam. Nicodemus is trying to defend Jesus, and they dehumanize Nicodemus to say, "No, you are wrong. Are you from Galilee too?" Do you see the dehumanization in that? So this consistency in the four Gospels has also been confirmed, and there are Talmudic resources that confirm this prejudice against Galileans. The Talmud is a central text of rabbinic Judaism and the primary source of Jewish religious law and Jewish theology. This confirms it. I said Josephus confirms this. And you notice how this regional bias is just casually weaved into the story. It's not like this made-up fiction line. It's just part of it because it was part of the culture when they were writing this. Peter is the disciple we know most about because he's written in all four of the Gospels. In all four of the Gospels, write Peter in the same way. So first of all, what a strong personality Peter must have had to have this be the same way in all four Gospels. He is bold, he says the stupid things, he does the stupid things, and he is bold. All four Gospels paint him the same way. So I'm not going to go into that here because a lot of preachers like talking about Peter because we know so much about him, but just consider that thought for a moment. We know a lot about him because all four Gospels show Peter the same way. These are undesigned coincidences. So let's talk about some other characters in the Bible with these undesigned coincidences and how we pick up their personalities. So we're going to talk about Mary and Martha, these two special friends, women friends, by the way, of Jesus. Let's look at them from Luke 10:38 through 42. As Jesus and the disciples continued on their way to Jerusalem, they came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. Her sister Mary sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he taught. But Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." But the Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you're worried and upset over all these details. There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it will not be taken away from her." So these two women have very distinct personalities, and we see this in the consistency in the Gospels. Here in this story, Martha gets this gentle rebuke from Jesus because she's missing this opportunity. And here we have Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's taking in the act of being a disciple of Jesus. And here's another unintended coincidence. Acts 22:3. This is Paul. This is Luke recording Paul. And Paul is giving his autobiography here. He says, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in the city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel." Paul's describing his resume, and he's saying, at the feet of Gamaliel. Do you notice this unintended coincidence similarity? Mary is taking on the act of being a disciple of the rabbi. This is the Jewish way of education, and there are many Jewish statements, Jewish proverbs, saying to learn at the feet of the rabbi. And here, that was Luke recording that Mary was at the feet of Jesus. She's taking on the role of a disciple with the rabbi, which again, Luke, we'll get to next week, is all about women. And he made a statement here that Mary could be taught by a rabbi, like Paul was taught by Gamaliel. Big, big statement there. And of course, Jesus is chastising Martha for missing the opportunity because of Martha's, we're going to see here, strong-willedness, or older sisterness maybe. So again, here we meet Mary and Martha at the death of Lazarus. And take action, Martha. First goes to meet Jesus. When Jesus finally comes, in John 11:21 through 22 says, Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." So here's, again, take charge, Martha. I'm going to say just this older sisterness of Martha, running out to Jesus, who's finally come. If you read the story, he delayed his coming. But then she says immediately, but I know you will do what is right. So her personality is forthright, but she's learning to become a disciple. Because she actually believes that maybe Jesus could still heal Lazarus even though he's dead. So Martha is argumentative, curious, and trusting at the same time. Personality type, that may be you, person watching this. Your curiosity may be giving you more doubts than more people. Fine, stay in the curiosity. Stay in the holy tension. Because you're going to trust Jesus. We just published a Bible study on Amazon. Trust issues with God. That is for you. You're going to find yourself in that Bible study. All right. So then Jesus challenges Martha back with these words. You may have heard them before. So Jesus told her, I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even after dying. Everyone who lives in me, believes in me, will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? So Jesus challenges this confrontation with Martha with 25 through 26. Jesus told her, I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me, believes in me, will never die again. Do you believe this, Martha? Do you see how this pattern, how Jesus and Martha interact? It's an unintended, undesigned coincidence of just Martha's strong personality. Now we have Mary next. She comes to Jesus in 11:32. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Mary fell at his feet again. Mary is not argumentative or curious as much as Martha. And Jesus does not challenge Mary as he challenges Martha in that response. But again, we see Martha's personality again in verse 39. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Once again, it's not this, wow, Jesus called Lazarus out of the grave. It's like, whoa, older sister stuff. Oh, he's going to smell terribly. I got to go take care of the situation. Take care of the crowd. That first instinct out of Martha, right? I do think she wanted the miracle, but I don't think she could outthink herself here and worrying about the crowd. Just an interesting note in this whole story of Lazarus, he has no voice. He's just the sick man, the dead man, and the alive man. No words from him. But the women get the voice in the story. Think about that. So we meet Mary one more time. Again, you're going to see the same Mary coming through here. Mark 14:3. Meanwhile, Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon, a man who had previously had leprosy. While he was eating, a woman came in with the alabaster jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard. She broke open the jar and poured the perfume over his head. Bethany. This is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. And then in John 12:1-3, 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor. Martha served, and Lazarus was personality here, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary, once Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance. In Mark, the woman is not named, but notice the geography. Notice the casualness of the geography that's added in, that when you read the Gospels together and you look for these unintended coincidences, oh, yes. And then here's the story. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus is anointed for his death. And Mary is once again at his feet, doing something at his feet to anoint the Messiah. And Jesus once again defends Mary, that she chose the better option by going back to the Mark version where she's not mentioned. But Mark 14:7-9 says, but Jesus replied, leave her alone. Why criticize her for doing such a good thing to me? You will always have the poor among you, and you can help them whenever you want to, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could and has anointed my body for burial ahead of time. I tell you the truth, wherever the good news is preached throughout the world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed. And once again, Mary's at the feet of Jesus around powerful men. We are a part of a long history of Christianity. We have story arcs in this history. We're the largest story church. Some of these arcs are good. Some of these arcs are beautiful and rich and have shaped our church, have shaped the history of this world. Some of these story arcs are bad and also shape the view of our church in this world. So we're going to talk about one of these historical arcs here in the next few weeks. This historical arc that we're in right now that causes the Bible to be used as a weapon, the clobber verses. We're going to talk about how we read the Bible in echo chambers. But I want to bring this up about these unintended coincidences and why they are so important for us and how we read the Bible. This is a quote from Lydia McGrew's book, but she's quoting another Bible scholar named John Wenham. His book is Easter Enigma, and why these unintended coincidences that bring this story into a deeper level is so important. Quote, the tendency today, however, is the opposite. It's to force the New Testament writings into disharmony in order to emphasize their individuality. The current and analytical approach to the Gospels often has the effect of making scholars more and more uncertain at more points, till eventually their view of Jesus and his teachings is lost in haze. The harmonistic approach, on the other hand, enables one to ponder long and conscientiously over every detail of the narrative and see how one account illuminates and modifies another. Gradually, without fudging, people and events take shape and grow in solidity, and the scenes come to life in one's mind. Such study is beautifully constructive. We're in week 2, and aren't you finding this study to making the Gospels becoming more beautiful to you, more amazing to you, and you want to read and find this stuff? Yes. This is where we're going as a church. Thanks for joining with us. Continue to be amazed. Next week is the Gospel of Luke. Amen.